I am a litigator on the defense side. I'm also an arbitrator mediator. I currently mediate primarily, and that's for the Southern District of New York Federal Court as a panel mediator. And we're going to go through an ADR exercise now. And joining me, you can look at their bios, I'm going to speed through this, but on the panel with me we have Steve Hull, who you all know. And then we have Stephanie Short, who will be one of our witnesses, has graciously agreed to be a witness, as has Steve, who has gone from the Concorde to a senior flight attendant for purposes of today's program.
What a guy. What a demotion.
Who everybody also knows quite well, who was on the previous panel, Jim Robinson and John DeLue. Now, I want to make just a couple of really quick comments in general. First of all, about Avicon. I'm one of the lucky ones who have been with Avicon since its start about 20 years ago. And a little bit of a legacy is the very first carrier used on Avicon was Heir Apparent, who has returned to us here today. I am told that Best Gate has just transitioned from reorganization to liquidation. For those of you who have been here in previous years, evidently they have a terrible loss history and they are now basically uninsurable. So Best Gate Airlines has seen better days. I really want to thank everybody involved with Avicon, Joe Reynolds, Jan Reynolds, Jeremy Reynolds, Ken Dunlop, and also Kyle Conway, who does everything with the animations, the fact patterns, deals with last-minute changes, including one about a minute ago, and is really just the right arm in doing all this. But this is truly a wonderful event, and I think it speaks volumes for how lucky we are as aviation law and insurance practitioners that we can I can look into this room, as all of you can, and see people, whether they be insurers, defense counsel, plaintiff counsel, consultants, government people, and despite what other lawyers and other practice areas relationships might be, many of these people are friends in every sense of the word. And we are truly lucky, and I literally tell friends that I'm blessed to practice in this area and meet the people I do, and I think many of us in this room share that sentiment, and this conference is really a testament to that really unique relationship. So with that being said, we are going to run the video. Everybody should have received a single piece of paper, and we are going to be litigating simply the issue of comparative or apportionment of fault with respect to the gentleman who jumped out of the airplane. I am asking all of you not to look at the passenger profile yet, and we're going to see the animation one more time. And I would ask you to give me a percentage allocation as between the airline and the passenger. I will tell you that the caterer is not involved, and you will see why the facts really do not implicate the caterer as they will be further developed. So I'll share that with you now. And with no further ado, let's run the animation one last time.
There's nobody laughing.
Roger, R75. What is the nature of your emergency?
Something struck me from below. I believe it was another aircraft.
Roger, R75. Understand you are declaring emergency. Stand by. R75, can you land runway 01 if I can get it?
Roger, 01.
R75, you are cleared for straight-in approach to runway 01. Hold for emergency response on the way. hold short, runway 01. Inbound traffic has declared emergency.
Roger that, Tower. Take off on 27.
ARSF, we have a landing gear collapse on 01, requesting fire services and emergency rescue.
Tower, any status? We are sitting here and would like to return to the gate.
Negative, air apparent. The military has grounded all traffic until the mess is cleaned up. I'll let you know when I know.
Roger that, Tower. Folks, this is the captain. I just spoke to Control Tower. Looks like we're going to be sitting here a little while longer.
This is unbelievable.
Sir,
Come
return to your
on,
seat,
try to
sir,
just
sir.
fucking call. Shit, fuck.
All right, lights. Those of you who were with us this morning, I asked you to put a number 1 and a number 2 and a number 3 on your sheet. At number 1, I would ask you, based only upon the video you have seen, to give me two numbers adding up to 100%, in which one number is the liability of the carrier and the other one is of heir apparent, and the other is the liability of the passenger. And I would ask you to keep those sheets open. While we do this, I'm going to ask our counsel to move down to the counsel table, leaving our witnesses on the stand. And now I'm going to read the passenger profile to you and ask you to write a second number, which is your portion of the fault after you hear this. Even if it stays the same, write it down. But here are the stipulated facts after this passenger. I will add that the counsel and witnesses have additional stipulated facts that you will not see, but I am begging them to stay on script and not change the facts, but they can certainly use the wiggle room that is left for them within the facts. The additional information as to this passenger, which is fatality 1, his name is Alfred Jones, a male. He's American, age 50, occupied as a chemist for DuPont, and married, making $200,000 a year. Mr. Jones suffered from bipolar disorder and anxiety panic disorder and carried prescription medication in his carry-on luggage. His carry-on luggage was moved by a flight attendant who was unaware of his condition. Unable to find his medication, the passenger attempted to disembark via the front service door. He suffered severe head trauma, causing his death, and that is the additional fact pattern. So we know that he was on medication, he had his bag with him, the bag was moved, unable to take his medication, he panicked, and we are calling this the case of premature evacuation. Right?
Without medication.
Without medication, thank you. All right. Now we will proceed with openings. Mr. Green for the plaintiff.
Sure. I'm going to sit. Two things. One is I would have demanded a $10,000 retainer before I took this case. But to the arbitrator, what I would say is Mr. Jones suffered from a condition, like many people, and he was responsible for his condition. He had medication that would alleviate his condition, and he told the flight attendant, that horrid person, the flight attendant over here, about
Which
his
flight
condition.
attendant is that? Is that flight attendant 1? Mr.
Flight attendant
Hall
one.
is flight attendant 1, Stephanie is flight attendant 2, and John is going to be a court-appointed expert on cabin services.
So Mr. Jones did everything he could to take care of his condition. He sought medical treatment, he carried medication. When he got on the airplane, he went to flight attendant 1. He told flight attendant 1 about his condition, about his need for the medication. He told her or him, the pattern has you as a woman, but told him that...
Only at the weekend.
Told him that he had his medication in his bag. And then after they were on the ground for over 2 hours, he again told flight attendant number 1 that he needed his medication and he couldn't find his bag, and flight attendant 1 did not help him, and he succumbed to his anxiety. He's not responsible for running off the airplane, and all of the fault should be laid at the door of flight attendant 1. If Flight Attendant 1 had done his or her job, this never would have happened.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell us, anything with respect to the door, or was the door properly attended?
Well, I think that's a good point. One of the things that they are supposed to do is protect passengers from potentially injuring themselves when the airplane's being catered, and that didn't happen here. They just let the door open. They let the gap exist, and if they followed the procedures that were in place, this never would have happened.
And are those procedures part of your case? Will they be presented to me later?
Yes, it will be.
Do you have anything else, Mr. Green?
Nope.
Okay. Mr. Robinson, I would ask that if you can, address your comments as much to the gallery as to the arbitrator. I will not be insulted by the back of your head.
Okay.
Well coiffed as
Do
it
that.
is.
Thank you, folks. I represent Air Apparent, the most passionate airline in the world. We are truly sorry that this happened, but I think as the facts will show, this was not of our doing. We were taxiing to take off, and unfortunately there arose a national security issue with the other aircraft that was stopped on the runway in front of us. After 2 hours, we did what any responsible airline would do. We brought on additional provisions to keep our passengers comfortable, keep them hydrated. We brought on food. That's why the catering truck was there. We knew that the plaintiff had a medical issue. He advised our flight attendant number 1, that he needed his medication. And flight attendant 1 said, keep it with you. Keep it on your person. Put it in the seat pocket in front of you. But the passenger didn't listen. He was given that instruction. He ignored it. Instead, he put it in the bag in the overhead bin. Now, as everyone knows, moving bags is part of the service that the airline provides to its customers. And on this day, unfortunately, it became necessary to rearrange those bags. This is part of the ordinary operation of an airline. It's nothing that we did that would incur liability in the ordinary course of our business. And certainly in this case, we have no liability for having moved his bag. With regard to opening the door, that's not a passenger exit. Every passenger on that plane came in from a different door. In exiting the plane, they should have known not to push our flight attendant to the ground, open the door themselves, and then leap out without looking, seeing that there's no step, no jet brake. So again, no liability on the airline. Thank you.
Mr. Robinson, are there any procedures that the airline has whereby a passenger with special needs can advise the airline of that condition before boarding? In other words, was there anything that could have put the airline in general on notice of this condition before the informal advice was
Yes,
given?
just like any passenger with special needs, whether it's medication or a service animal or mobility, they have the ability to advise the airline that they have these special needs, and the airline will accommodate them. This passenger made no attempt to advise us in advance that he had a medication need, but he did tell the flight attendant when he got on board that I need access to this medication in flight, and was advised keep it on your person or keep it within reach. Don't put it in your overhead bin.
Thank you. Any rebuttal, Mr. Green, before we proceed with our first witness?
I think it's clear that the council is just trying to blame the victim here. This gentleman did inform Flight Attendant 1 that he had this specific need, and he did tell her, or him, that the medication is in his bag. It's true that she claims now, or he claims now that he told him to put it on his person. Obviously, we can't ask my client, because he died, whether that's the case. But there's
You did stipulate to that fact.
but there's no testimony. There's no testimony in the case that when he saw him putting the bag up, that he said, no, hey, remember to take the medication out. And I think what's key is not only did he tell him about the condition and the need for the medication? But then when he was in distress, when he was suffering the panic attack, he didn't just run off the airplane. He asked for help from flight attendant number 1. He told flight attendant number 1 that he had this condition, and he didn't get the help that he should have gotten. Flight attendant 1 could have prevented this horrible accident, and he didn't do what he should have done.
This is arbitration, so sir, rebuttal is allowed, is what I would say.
You know, in the context of what we're doing here today, which is to assign blame or liability as between the airline and the passenger, Mr. Green is certainly entitled to say that we're blaming the victim, but I think in the context of what we're trying to do today is to assign fair responsibility for the occurrences. So we can label it whatever you want, but at some point we have to acknowledge that the passenger had a responsibility for his own actions and failed to take those reasonable steps that would have prevented this incident.
All right, shall we proceed with the first witness, flight attendant number 1, Mr. Stephen Hull. Mr. Hull, before we proceed with Mr. Green's direct examination, can you tell us a little bit about your background? And also, please, for the benefit of everybody, about the responsibilities as between flight attendant 1 and flight attendant 2 vis-a-vis whatever chain of command may be in place on the aircraft for the cabin crew.
I've been a flight attendant for a number of years. If you'd like to know the exact amount of years, I can tell you. I was the in-charge crew member on the day. That was something that is done on seniority in our airline. I assigned the positions of number 2 and number 3 flight attendant, and we carried on as we normally do. Is there anything else you need me to say? It was a normal flight.
I'm sorry?
It was a normal flight, normal departure.
So you were the in-charge flight attendant?
In-charge crew member, yes.
So you were in charge of the other 2 flight attendants, number 2 and number 3?
Yes.
And on the day of the accident, you met a gentleman by the name of Alfred Jones. Is that correct?
I did indeed.
And Mr. Jones told you that he suffers from an anxiety condition, correct?
No, he did not.
What did he tell you?
He said he had medication that he is required to take.
Right, and he said it was, he needed to take it within an hour?
He needed to take it hourly, I believe.
Okay. And he said it was in his bag, correct?
Correct.
And what did you tell Mr. Jones?
Because I wasn't aware of the condition. It may have been cold, flu, hay fever, back pain, leg pain. I didn't know. So I suggested the best place for him to keep the medicine would be on his person or in a seat pocket in front of him for easy access.
And did you see him stow his bag?
I did not, no.
Okay. Did you tell flight attendant number 2 or flight attendant number 3 about Mr. Jones's need for his medication?
No.
Okay. And after the delay, you had another conversation with Mr. Jones, correct?
I did.
And Mr. Jones told you that he urgently needed to take his medication, correct?
Correct.
And he told you that his bag was missing, correct?
He said he couldn't find his bag, yes.
Can everybody hear? We all good? Okay.
And you told Mr. Jones that you would look into it, correct?
I did.
And you did not find Mr. Jones' bag for him, correct?
I had 90 other passengers to look into their
My
problems
question-
as well.
I appreciate your answer. My question is, you did not find his bag for him when he told you he urgently needed his medication. You did not go and find his bag for him?
Not at that moment, no, I did
And
not.
you didn't tell flight attendant number 2 that Mr. Jones urgently needed his medication?
I did not.
And you observed Mr. Jones in a high state of anxiety, correct?
Not necessarily. I
Well, when
wouldn't
he
say
told,
that.
when he told you that he urgently needed his medication, how would you describe his demeanor?
As like most passengers who've been sat on an aeroplane for 2 hours waiting to depart.
Okay.
They're all a bit anxious.
Let me ask you a question. This airline of yours, what did they train you to do when a passenger told you, quote unquote, I urgently need medication?
I would try to do that in a good, well, I try to do that as quick as I possibly can, but there was no time at that moment because there was other things going on to direct all my attention onto one passenger. And at that moment, I did believe that he had, even though he couldn't find his bag, I did believe he still had his medication in his seat pocket, where I thought where I told him he should put it.
So he can't find his bag, and he's telling you he urgently needs his medication, and he needs his bag. But your interpretation is he actually had his medication on him?
No, I didn't. There was no direct interpretation of what he was saying. At that stage, it was 2 hours into the flight, or 2 hours into the delay, I thought, or I probably maybe forgot, or had other things to do. There was lots of things going on at the time, as you can appreciate. We had a catering vehicle coming to top up the catering. I had requests from other passengers as well, people missing their flights. There was a lot going on. So to concentrate on that one passenger, no, I wasn't aware what his condition was. It could have been something reasonably minor.
Wouldn't you agree that if a passenger says that they urgently need medication, that it's reasonable, maybe a safe assumption would be that's an important issue to deal with, not something minor?
I'd put that issue towards the top of the list of things I had to do at the time.
I have
But
a
there were other
question
things.
for the witness. What was the state of the cabin at the time? In other words, were passengers required to be in their seats, seatbelt fastened, or were they themselves allowed to move about the aircraft?
The seatbelt sign was off at the time because clearly after 2 hours people are going to need to use the restroom, so there were passengers moving around.
So he could have looked himself at that point?
He could have done.
Continue.
You heard Mr. Jones say, quote, "I cannot control my anxiety without my medication, please hurry."
I don't remember hearing that.
In terms of when he told you he needed his medication and he couldn't find his bag, you didn't ask flight attendant number 2 or flight attendant number 3 whether they knew where the bag was, did you?
No.
And you didn't go and actually search for his bag
No.
in response. It's true that you didn't do anything when he told you he urgently needed his medication and couldn't find his bag in terms of helping him, and I appreciate you had other things to do. I'm saying you did not take any action to address his request.
Not immediately.
Not ever.
Not immediately. The issue is, I didn't know what his bag looked like. It could have been a wild goose chase, really, going around 30 bins trying to find somebody's bag that I didn't know.
When
I
you
didn't know
say
what they
not
were.
immediately, at no time between when he made that request and when he suffered his fatal injury, did you attempt to go find his bag?
I did not.
No further questions.
Sir, would you agree with me that the safety of the passengers is one of the primary responsibilities of a flight attendant?
It's the only responsibility of the flight attendant.
And at the time that you'd been sitting on the airfield for 2 hours, isn't it true that some of the passengers were becoming unruly? There were fights, there were some injuries, there was damage to the interior of the aircraft?
There was lots of problems going on, and lots of passengers were agitated. Lots of passengers were getting very, very angry and very vocal and very physical with other passengers. It wasn't a pleasant place to be.
So faced with that environment, and you've got 92 passengers on board, correct?
Yes.
When you are then asked by one of the passengers to help them locate their carry-on bag, what priority would you assign that as compared with the injury to other passengers and the damage and the agitation that's going on in the cabin?
The difficulty always is that the situation is fluid and things are happening, so the number one priority soon becomes the number 2 priority as something else happens. And when you're walking up and down the cabin, you cannot see to everybody's priority. It's just impossible.
If a passenger said, "I need medication for anxiety," did he describe to you what anxiety would mean to him, how he would react, how his anxiety would manifest itself?
I had no idea what his anxiety was.
Okay, so you didn't know whether he would become quiet or simply internally agitated or something else, correct?
I had no idea.
Did he at any time tell you, if I don't take my medication, I'm going to run off the aircraft?
No,
He didn't say that.
no.
Moving passengers' baggage from one overhead bin to another, is that a normal routine service that happens on planes?
Absolutely. With the increasing amounts of passenger baggage being brought on board, there's always, on a full flight, it's very, very difficult to accommodate all the passengers' baggage. Sometimes you have to move things to accommodate other larger items. That's just the way it is.
And in every case, do you tell every passenger, I need to move your bag from one bin to another, or are you trying to get those bins closed so that the airline can safely operate that flight?
Object to the compound question. Go ahead.
My view is you try to remember to do that. But, and on most occasions that would be the case where you would advise the passenger you're moving their hand baggage. But in the excitement of departure or the pressure of departure, when they're trying to close the door and trying to get the aeroplane pushed back, sometimes it is forgotten.
Thank you.
So you testified that the safety of the passengers is your overriding concern as a flight attendant for the airline.
Indeed, yes.
And you'd agree that that the duty of a flight attendant includes, when they're moving bags, to notify the passenger, in most cases, that they're actually moving their bag, correct?
I'd like to think that we do that most of the time.
Right, and that's part of the responsibilities of the flight attendant when they're moving someone's bag, most of the time, to let the person know.
No, I don't think it's a responsibility. It's not a duty of care. It's a thing that probably would be an advisable thing to do if you remember. But when you're moving lots and lots of bags, and that's not the only bag that was being moved on that day. Lots of bags were being moved to accommodate the 92 passengers, 2 handbags.
And the reason to notify the passenger is because the passenger may have valuables in their bag, correct?
No.
Okay, the reason is the passenger may have medication in their bags.
No.
So the flight attendant, why would you want to notify the passenger in most cases?
It's almost like so that when the departure process comes, it can be a lot easier. If you have every passenger trying to scrabble around trying to find their bag, it could delay the deplaning procedure. So,
and in terms of your concern for the safety of the passenger, counsel asked you some questions about other things that were going on at the time. Were any other passengers asking for their medication?
no, that was the only passenger that was asking for medication.
Okay.
Mr. Hunt, can you know that? Can you know what specifically what?
I know I couldn't say that's absolutely true, but asking me for medication.
Okay.
And no other passenger was saying that they were having a medical problem than Mr. Jones?
Not on that particular flight.
Further question?
Anything else?
Nothing further.
All right. Stephanie Short, you were the second flight attendant, and would you tell us a little bit about your background and what your duties are as number 2 on that flight?
I was the flight attendant number 2 on the flight in question. I've been a flight attendant for a couple of years. As the number 2 flight attendant, I do what flight attendant number 1 tells me to do. On that particular day, I was assigned to the front of the coach cabin, and I was also assigned to handle the catering when catering came to restock the flight about 2 hours in.
Okay.
Mr. Green?
Thank you. So just a few questions.
Sure.
First thing is, you say you do everything that flight attendant 1 tells you to do. Is that right?
Correct.
And did flight attendant number 1 ever tell you that Mr. Jones had a medical issue?
He did not.
And did flight attendant number 1 ever tell you that Jones had medication in his bag?
He did not.
And when you moved Mr. Jones's bag, correct?
Correct.
And at the time when you moved Mrs. Jones's bag, you didn't know that there was medication in that bag, aircraft, did you?
That is correct.
And that's because flight attendant number 1 didn't tell you about Mr. Jones's medication.
That's correct, and Mr. Jones also did not notify me that there was medication in his bag.
And if you had been notified by flight attendant number 1 that Mr. Jones had medication in that bag, would you have told Mr. Jones that you were moving his bag?
Certainly, and I think that I probably did at least try to find the owner of the bag when I moved it. I'll be frank, I don't recall what Mr. Jones' response was when that happened, but I'm sure I said, I'm moving this bag, whose bag is this, and he may or may not have responded, I don't recall.
But you
Let
don't,
me just ask I get to ask questions too, Bucky. Do you have a specific recollection of telling Mr. Jones, or are you telling us that it would be your typical procedure to do that, and you were assuming you did it in this case?
I'm saying it would be my typical procedure to ask, when I'm moving a bag, to ask the passengers around the bag, whose bag is this, I'm going to be moving it, and I don't recall a response from any passenger. I don't specifically recall the instance. It's possible, even likely, that I'd moved more than one bag at the beginning of this flight, and I don't recall specifically.
but just to be clear, when you moved Mr. Jones's bag, you did not know there was medication in the bag.
That is correct.
And when you moved the bag, you didn't know that Mr. Jones had actually told flight attendant number 1 that he needed to take his medication on the flight.
That is correct.
And had you known that, you certainly would have made sure that Mr. Jones knew what you were doing with his bag, correct?
Correct.
And actually, later on in the flight, you were involved in the catering, getting the door open for the caterers, right?
Yes.
And you were positioned up by the door when Mr. Jones ran by you and went out the door.
Correct.
And at that time, when you opened the door, when you were involved with the opening the door for the caterer, you didn't know Mr. Jones had talked to flight attendant number 1 about his need for his medication.
No, I don't.
And you didn't know that he had said he couldn't control himself because of his anxiety. He was overheard saying that, even though flight attendant number 1 denies hearing that.
I certainly did not.
Okay. And you didn't have any idea that Mr. Jones was having any problems when he ran past you and went out the door.
Well, running down the aisle and running past me out the door indicated that perhaps he was having a problem, but no, I did not know.
Okay. And just to be clear, you didn't position a cart between the door and passengers to protect passengers from inadvertently going out that door.
No, but I at the time that I unlatched the door, I did ensure that there was no passengers around me, and I mean, it wasn't until after I'd unlatched the door that Mr. Jones ran down the aisle and pushed me over to exit the aircraft.
Are you familiar with the gate side procedures for catering?
I am.
Okay. Do you agree that the gate side procedures apply to you when you were involved with the catering truck on the day of the accident?
No, we actually don't have specific procedures for on-ramp catering as opposed to at-gate catering.
Is your position that the gate side procedures, which are designed to protect passengers, don't apply if you're doing it on-ramp catering?
I mean, I think that they're a good guideline, but they are certainly not they're not specific to the on-ramp procedures.
Sorry, please finish your answer. Did you finish your answer?
Yes.
Had you encountered before in your career as a flight attendant an instance in which a catering truck was dispatched to the aircraft while the aircraft was delayed on either a runway or a taxiway, or was this the first time in your experience that this happened?
This was the first instance where I experienced an on-ramp catering procedure.
Are there, the gate side procedures are to protect passengers, correct?
I don't know why they enacted these procedures, but I'm sure that that's a thought that went into it, and
So
I can't really speak to that.
Procedure 11.11.3.7 says.
Would you like me to bring that up?
Sure.
Sorry, it's at the bottom.
It says, if practical, the flight attendant should position a beverage, can't read it on there, or meal cart to impede passenger access to the open door. You'd agree that that procedure is designed to protect passengers from gaining access to the open door, right?
That would make sense to me, yes.
Right. And, sorry?
That's his door expert checking in.
Do you agree that the risks of passengers gaining access to the open door are the same if the catering is being done gate side as it is if they're being done on the ramp?
Yeah.
Okay. And you believe, you agree that your duty was, under the circumstances, to position a beverage cart or meal cart between the door and the passengers?
It says if practicable, and you know, I'll be frank, I don't recall the circumstances at the time, but there may have been something happening that I don't remember that kept me from doing that. It's not an absolute duty for me to do that.
Sorry about that. I have no further questions.
This is addressed to both flight attendants. What are circumstances in which it would be impractical to position a cart to block access to the door?
Well, perhaps if flight attendant number 1 or number 3 had been doing a beverage service at that time and the cart wasn't available.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Hull, that would make it impractical?
Probably that, but I mean, it was an abnormal situation anyway. Abnormal situations, you need to adjust a procedure to suit what's going on.
All right, thank you. Mr. Robinson.
Thank you. Flight attendant number 2, is it an ordinary and normal part of your duties to move and position carry-on baggage in the overhead bins?
Yes, absolutely.
It's a service you provide to your passengers every day, right?
Yes.
And in this particular case, when the flight has been delayed for 2 hours, this was originally a very short flight, wasn't it, from Wilmington to Washington?
Correct.
Okay. So after 2 hours, you've got hungry, you've got thirsty passengers on board. Did the airline have an obligation to provide them with food and beverages after such a long delay?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that we had an obligation, but it certainly is advisable.
Okay. And that was the reason that you were opening that door, was to bring on food and water for your passengers, right?
Correct. No one wants to be sitting on the ramp for 3 hours without adequate supplies.
Okay. And again, providing food and beverages to your passengers is a service that you normally provide to your passengers, right?
Yes.
Now, you were asked about whether or not you should have positioned a beverage cart to prevent somebody getting to that doorway. Now, that procedure is normally followed while the provisioning is going on, while the caterers are moving carts back and forth from their truck onto the aircraft, correct? But you hadn't reached that point, had you?
Yeah, correct. I mean, in fact, I'd unlatched the door, but it hadn't been open. Mr. Jones pushed the door open himself. So, yeah, you're correct.
Right. So at that point, would it have been appropriate to have a cart positioned behind you at that point, or after you opened the door, would you have then positioned a cart to block access?
Yeah, I mean, I think after the door was opened and the catering service was starting to stock the plane, at that point I would have moved a cart to be restocked.
So, and if we look at actually the purpose of putting a cart into the area there to prevent access, you yourself were standing in the way. You were blocking access to that door at the moment that Mr. Jones charged the door, correct?
Correct.
In fact, he had to physically push you out of the way to get to the door, didn't he?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. No other questions?
What are there are also procedures with regard to when you are at the gate. What is the procedure for opening the door? Who has responsibility for opening when the catering is performed gate side under the gate side procedures for air apparent?
So under the gate side procedures, what happens is I would stand by the door if I'm the flight attendant assigned, and when I see the catering, then I would unlatch and disarm the slide, and when the caterer approached the door and was at the appropriate location, they would knock, and I would give the go-ahead to open the door, and then the caterer would open the door from the outside.
Mr. Green, do you have anything?
No further questions.
Okay. All right, thank you. I will give both, since we're about now to move into the expert testimony, and this is the loosey-goosey world of arbitration. If either attorney has any questions for either of the fact witnesses, you may feel free to address them now. Okay, all clear? All right, well, thank you, but you are still available. So again, in arbitration, these witnesses are recallable at counsel's discretion as other issues may arise. I would now like to introduce John DeLue. John DeLue is a court-appointed expert. In other words, he has no, he's not aligned with either side. He's, or I should say, an arbitrator-appointed expert. And both parties will have a go at him to find out what we can about the procedures and what may or may not have been done or should have been differently. John, would you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure.
And then that'll be Mr. Green's chance to begin with direct examination.
Okay, I've been an airline pilot for over 30 years, captain, soup rating of the 787, so I'm familiar with this particular fleet type that's in question. I've also been an accident investigator. I teach accident investigations, so I feel very comfortable being able to discuss this with you. And hearing some of the questions, I think you can add on to clarify some of the questions that were brought forth.
Are you familiar with and have you had a chance to review air appearance procedures for catering itself?
I have.
And just as a general question, without any opinions as to whether they applied, with regard to their gate side procedures for the handling of catering, do they meet what you would consider to be the industry standard for a gate side catering?
They do, but for clarification, we keep referring to as gate side. So let me just level set. The reality of an airplane being catered on a runway is there's no procedure for that. And we would make a procedure. First of all, we wouldn't have an airplane sitting on a runway for 2 hours. That's actually against procedures from the FAA because we're worried about someone landing on top of another airplane. So the reality that they were sitting there for 2 hours because of a military situation is very, very rare. And we keep referring to the thing about gate side procedures. This is a runway catering procedure. There's a big difference between having catering on a gate or catering a ramp and catering a runway. So it's very rare to have a runway catering. So some of the questions that were asked, we kept talking about gate side. This is not gate side. This is a runway. This is a very rare situation to have. There are no procedures written because there will never be a procedure written for catering an airplane on the runway.
Sorry, I'm a little confused.
Okay.
So there are gate side procedures for catering, correct?
There are, but you have to understand when you say gate side. So normally, 99% of the time, an airplane is going to be catered either before the passengers are aboard or when they're coming aboard, but that's with a jet bridge mated to the aircraft, if there are passengers coming out and off, whatever. Typically, we don't push an airplane back until all the doors are armed. So one of the questions brought earlier is we always, before we push the airplane back, the flight attendants will arm the doors. We do that for a reason, because you could push back 30 feet and have a fire on the APU, airplane full of fire. As soon as the flight attendant opens the door, all the slides automatically deploy. So nobody will fall out of an airplane, they'll slide down the slides. So the doors are already armed the minute we start to push off the gate. And they stay armed until we get to the arrival station and get to the gate there. So flight attendants are not allowed to disarm the door for any reason whatsoever, unless an emergency goes. Because if the flight attendant disarmed the door, for whatever reason, they have to stop and open the door for emergency evacuation, the slide will not deploy. And now we have fatalities as people fall out of the airplane. So the catering is always done when we say gate side. That would be a fact. The only time you'd have a catering issue when you were not at a gate would be if an abnormal situation. So in the case of this particular case here, a lot of times airplanes are waiting for a gate, thunderstorms in the area, there's lightning on the ramp. You can't have, when lightning's in the ramp, they have to take the folks off the ramp. Well, there's a Department of Transportation rule that you cannot have people stuffed on an airplane for more than 3 hours. The fine is $25,000 per passenger. So the airlines will do whatever they can to get you to the gate. Sometimes it just doesn't happen. And if that was the case, and you needed to go ahead and bring some supplies on, let's say, the airplane, it's an abnormal procedure then to cater the aircraft while it's not made to the jet bridge, for instance. So that's why you say gate side, referring to a normal procedure where you're normally, bringing food or drinks on board an aircraft.
Okay, so my question was, there are gate side procedures, right?
when you're actually in the gate, correct?
Okay, and the purpose of the gates, and the flight attendants have to follow the gate side procedures, that's part of their duties, right?
Absolutely.
And you're describing the ramp catering process as an abnormal event, correct?
If they're being catered while they're off of the gate itself, right? So
That's
if you're
right.
gonna be catered on the ramp, which would be very unusual, that would be a different type of procedure.
And it's more unusual, and you'd agree that the same precautions that a flight attendant takes for gate side catering should also be followed when they're doing a ramp catering event, correct?
Correct.
And frankly, because it's abnormal, they probably should have a heightened sense of responsibility to make sure passengers don't go near that door, correct?
You would want to try to have a little bit more attention for passengers coming forward to it or coming approaching the door, because realize at that point, if you're going to open the door, you have disarmed the slide. So the flight attendants are aware that if they had to open the door any further and people start to congregate towards the area, there's no slide and people will, well, as we know, will fall to there. Usually it's fatal.
And one of the precautions that flight attendants are directed to take when they're engaged in gate side procedures is to put a beverage or meal cart between the door and where the passengers are congregating, correct?
Well, if I recall, the exact procedure says it's recommended, it's practical. So when they say practical, there's a reason it's practical, because if they put a beverage cart there, then the people who are the number one, who are the lavatory, can't get in and out themselves. So if they put the cart there, the person comes in the lavatory screaming and yelling, they're going to go out the door. So you can't say to put the cart, because you're actually going to keep someone stuck in the lavatory.
Well, the flight attendant could actually check and see if anyone's in the laboratory.
You can.
And then put the cart there.
Absolutely.
And if, and in this circumstance, there's no facts to suggest that flight attendant number 2 over there
Right.
could.
Well,
could have put the-
well,
put the
exactly.
beverage
I
cart
mean,
there.
that's why it says it's practical. So I don't know the situation. There might have been someone in the laboratory at the time, or someone was sick. Or,
But there's no evidence suggesting that it was not practical.
Mr. Lou, quick question. If there was catering, that the objects, the catering items being brought in have to go somewhere, and if going somewhere involved bringing them aft, for
Correct.
example, would it be practical to have the cart?
it would not, because the cart itself would probably be rolled on and off the catering truck. So if the catering truck was brought up to the height of the aircraft, they usually roll trucks, the catering, the galley carts on and off. In this case here, they hadn't brought the thing up to the same height of the airplane, so if they were just going to hand up supplies, then it would have been a different story. So I'm not sure what the intent of the caterer is.
The airline knows that some of its passengers have medical needs, right?
If the passenger informs them, I guess.
And flight attendants are told to take seriously a passenger who informs the flight attendant of his or her medical need and in particular, the need for medication, right?
Correct.
And you'd agree that flight attendant, in this case, did not meet his responsibilities in responding to Mr. Jones's medical needs?
Well, no, I would not agree, actually, because in the airline business, what they do is the number one flight attendant actually did what we would expect to be standard practice in the industry. You would always tell the passenger, if you have medication that's that important to you, keep it on your person. The reason being is this was a short flight, and we normally would leave the seatbelts on if there's any turbulence. We don't want to tell the flight attendant or the passenger, leave it in your bag, because if the passenger has to get up in flight to get his medication and we have turbulence, and that person becomes injured, the airline will then be sued. So we always would tell the passenger, leave it on your person, because you may have to remain seated for the entire flight. This was a relatively short flight. It would not be unusual for the passengers not to have the seatbelt sign turned off. So if that flight attendant, if that passenger needed their medication, it's in the interest of the safety of the other passengers, as well as that passenger, to have that medication on their person at all times.
Let me, I appreciate your answer. What I was really referring to, and it's my fault, is when Mr. Jones had 2 conversations with flight attendant number 1. The first one is the one you talked about just now. He told flight attendant number 1 that he needed the medication, and you just explained your position on that. But then he went back and he had a second conversation. In the second conversation, he told the flight attendant, hey, I'm having a problem. I can't find my medication. It's in the bag. And you heard flight attendant number 1 testify that he didn't help him. He didn't respond to that. And my question to you is, flight attendant number 1 should have responded to a passenger who is in extremis, telling him that he needs his medication?
Not exactly. So flight attendant number one answered earlier to that the number one reason, the only reason we have flight attendants on the airplane is for the safety of the passengers. It's not for catering, it's not for providing food, not for providing medication. That's not what we want flight attendants paid for. They're not certificated other than to make sure the airplane's got slides on for on-and-off departure and for the safety of the passengers. So we have many times people say they have medication. This may be a shock to you, counselor, but when people say medication, probably 75% of the time it's marijuana. That is their medication. And we're not going to get in the business of determining what medication is you have, what you don't have. A lot of times it's people have their little vaping machines. So the reality is that the flight attendant's job is safety. Our flight attendants, we don't actually even want them moving bags because they can be injured from the weight of the bag. So flight attendant number two mentioned that number one mentioned they might have moved the bag. That's true. When it says to another location, I'm not sure how far, but it probably was within about 20 feet because they wouldn't move the bag from the front all the way to the back. That would be unrealistic, particularly at arrival time. But the point is that they're there for their safety. So if the medication was that critical, flight attendant one did exactly what we'd expect that airline to do. You should have it on your person because we may have to actually egress the aircraft for an emergency. We may have to go off the end of the runway when we land at our arrival station. That person's medication will stay in the overhead bin while they have a psychiatric episode outside the airplane. So we always want them to keep it with the person.
But you're going back to the first interaction. I'm talking about the second. And you just mentioned a couple of important facts. Number one, the safety of the passenger is their job.
Correct.
Everything else they do, secondary.
Absolutely.
And in this case, they had a passenger who had a safety issue. And I appreciate your testimony about marijuana, but wouldn't you agree that when a passenger says they need their medication, the flight attendant should not assume the passenger is looking to get high, that they should assume that the medication is important to that passenger who's explaining that they need their medication?
Put this in the context of what you're asking, though. This particular crew had been sitting on runway for over 2 hours. It's a very stressful situation. Babies crying, people upset, people are angry at the flight attendants because it's their fault, they're late. We see this many times. And so the flight attendants are doing all they can to try to keep people stable and keep them calm. So when people say they need the medication, a lot of times people will say, I need my medication. It's actually in their suitcase in the bin of the aircraft. You can't get it for them. When you say medication could be, I think number one flight attendant mentioned it could have been their cold medicine. I mean, we're not expecting our flight attendants to get their bag down and open up their thing. So that particular case here, if the thing would have been just normal in flight, it's calm, I'm sure number one flight attendant would have got the medication. But this is an unusual situation on the inner runway for 2 hours. So you have to understand there's a lot of stress going on this entire thing, and there are other 92 other passengers going into it.
I appreciate
Mr. Kulu, I'm going to interrupt you with a question, Justin, I apologize. Taking what you know of the circumstances, what would the passenger have had to have said, at a minimum, to flight attendant number one to make finding his medication the top priority for that flight attendant?
They probably would have to have used much stronger language or started screaming or crying because that would have got their attention, saying there really was an issue to get this person's medicine.
What words? If you could script it, then it's going to trigger a duty for that flight attendant under those circumstances to make getting that medication the top priority, putting aside a more visceral response like a scream or a cry. What words? What are the magic words that in your mind, under those circumstances, would have triggered the responsibility of flight attendant number one to, in effect, drop everything and make retrieving that bag with the medication his top priority?
Probably either the words, I have an emergency, this is life-threatening for me, something to get the attention of the flight attendant that this was more than just I need my medicine and it could have been cold medicine.
He was heard to say to another passenger, and this is not something he relayed to the flight attendant, but I'm just curious as to what the effect might have been had it been relayed to the flight attendant. He was heard to say, this is in the stipulated facts to another passenger, I cannot control my anxiety without my medication. I'm sorry, this is what was said to the flight attendant. And I believe it was something else he was heard to say to another passenger.
He said to him, I cannot control my anxiety without my medication. Please hurry. And in response to that, flight attendant number 1 did nothing. Flight attendant number 1 didn't hurry. Flight attendant number 1 didn't look for his bag. Flight attendant number 1 didn't tell flight attendant number 2 about this situation. Flight attendant number 2 would have been able to find his bag very easily. So the question I have for you is, if safety is passengers is the number 1 priority, flight attendant number 1 didn't do the job that he was supposed to do.
Well, flight attendant number 1 and flight number 2, their number 1 job of safety is to help people if we happen to evacuate the aircraft, which is what they were doing the entire time.
I'm sorry, I have it back up, because that was what he said to another passenger. He was heard to say, but not to a flight attendant. So I'm gonna ask my question again, because I asked it poorly.
Okay.
If he had said to the flight attendant directly, I cannot control my anxiety without medication, please hurry, what would that have triggered?
I think the flight attendant would have thought that is something that we need to look into, but it wouldn't be the number 1 priority at the time. Because people will say that a lot on an airplane. When you're in an aluminum tube for 2.5 hours, everybody has anxiety, quite frankly. So some people say I need something for anxiety. Many times it means I need a drink. I need my own medication, whatever. The point is I don't
He's
think.
a neutral expert.
Right. Right, but I'm just giving you the reality, so I
His
think.
resume said he testified equally for plaintiff and defense, and I took that at face value.
Yeah. No, I think that it's easy to in this case here, to say the flight attendant should have done maybe more, but what I'm trying to say is in reality, I've been there personally, is when you have people that are stuck in an aluminum tube for 2.5 hours, people's behavior becomes somewhat erratic. And there were probably more than one person who had anxiety that morning. And the flight attendants were trying to do, because they're the ones, the cockpit crew is behind a locked door, and they're not coming back there. So the flight attendants are asked to kind of calm the situation for 90 plus people. And so they've got their hands full with not just one person, but with 92 people. There's crying babies and old people upset, people have to go to the restroom. So I think eventually the number 1 flight attendant would have got the medication. The question was, is at what point would they got it? And the fact that the door opened up to get supplies for the passengers, and he elected to run at that time, I don't know how the flight attendants, in all honesty, could have expected to handle just one person's anxiety when there were other 92 people who had the same issue.
Well, it wasn't just, hey, I need medication. He said, I need it urgently. He said, please hurry. He said, I can't control myself without it. I can't control my anxiety without it. And I appreciate your saying she could have done more, he could have done more, but he didn't do anything. And that's, at some point, we're kind of speculating that if this terrible event hadn't happened, eventually he would have responded, but there's absolutely no evidence of that.
Right, but he said to please hurry, and at that particular time when he said please hurry was about the time they were about to do a very unusual procedure, which is have a catering truck come up to an airplane on the runway. So the number 1 flight attendant clearly had understood the seriousness of that, because he assigned flight attendant 2 to guard the door. There was no expectation at that point that someone would run off the airplane, push aside and run out the door. So the anxiety that he was seeing, the flight attendants were also somewhat anxious, more likely, because they were doing something outside of the normal comfort zone, which is opening a door on a runway. So they were quite busy at that time, and probably the priority at that point was not to get that person's bag with anxiety at that point. They may have gotten there as soon as the door was shut. There was other things going on that prevented them from saying, let's stop everything and look for this guy's bag.
Anything else, Mr. Green?
I'd like to move to strike this expert.
I'm just telling you the real
He's never served as a flight attendant. He's a total dauber. He doesn't have the credentials to do this.
I'll weigh his testimony appropriately. Mr. Robinson?
I have no pleasure.
I did a great job. I should have asked any questions.
I do, and I would like to start with flight attendant Short. We discussed the gate side, and we testified very clearly about the gate side procedure for opening the service door for the caterer. Yet you deviated from that procedure in this instance. And as I think everybody agrees, we might disagree as to the significance of it, but everybody can agree that this is not a gate side catering. the question then becomes, should those procedures have nonetheless guided your conduct that day? And so my question to you is, if you could explain what your reasoning was for deviating from the standard standby, knock, thumbs up, the exterior person, the caterer opens the door, not you.
So I disagree that in that regards that I deviated from the procedures.
Deviated from what you would have done at gateside.
Yeah, no,
That's the question problem.
I disagree that I deviated from gateside procedures in that regards because I did not open the door. I merely unlatched the door. I had the catering in sight. And so I unlatched the door, it was disarmed, and it was not open. The door was not agape. When Mr. Jones ran through it, he actually came up after I'd disarmed the door and pushed it open himself and jumped out.
The door, there was a gap though. The door was not flush at that point, am I correct? That's how it's depicted in the video, is there is a gap, I know because I asked Kyle to put it there.
So she opened the door.
I guess you are correct. In that case, that I did, in fact, the door was slightly ajar at that time. And the reason for that was because, I mean, this was a new procedure to me, and the caterer was very close, and you know, I just did not have procedures to guide me for this particular circumstance. This was a circumstance I'd never been in before, and
Do you recall what was on your mind at the time? Were you distracted? Were you concerned about other onboard events? I know it's hard to.
Yeah,
capture that
absolutely.
moment, but-
Yeah, I mean, it was very chaotic. We'd been about to take off, and then all of a sudden we were stuck on the runway for over 2 hours. The passengers were unruly. I mean, we had people yelling at us constantly, and I mean, it was a very stressful and hectic situation at the time. It certainly was not calm, so I did have a lot on my mind at the time.
Did you have any discussion with Mr. Hull as to what procedure you should adopt on the spot for this unusual runway catering event?
No, we did not have that conversation. We were all pretty busy dealing with various issues within the cabin. Mr. Hall said to me to please handle the catering procedure, and we did not discuss it in any detail how we would proceed.
Mr. Hull, hypothetically, because this is arbitration, if Ms. Short had asked you what's the procedure for opening, what's the procedure for accepting a catering delivery on the runway, what would you have told her?
It's an abnormal procedure, so I wouldn't give too much guidance. The way I see it is that this was a one-off. That I asked flight attendant number 2 to deal with the catering, and I believe that the number 2 flight attendant would do it to the best of her trained ability.
Mr. DeLue, the
Yes.
procedure, as we have up here on the board, 11.3.5 through 6. The caterer should knock on the door, after which the flight attendant shall visually confirm that the slide is disarmed, and thereafter signal thumbs up to the caterer indicating that it's all clear to open the door. 11.3.6, upon receipt of the all clear signal, the caterer will open, the caterer will, not should, will open the cabin door from the outside and proceed with the catering process. 3.7 deals with the bag, placing a card if practical, and somewhat lost at the bottom, it says, other than in case of emergency or under instructions, there we go. Other than in case of emergency or under instructions from the flight crew, no flight attendant should open any door from the inside.
Correct. So,
Let me ask, please wait for my question.
yes,
Are there safety justifications for that set of rules?
Absolutely. So people may not be aware of this, but normally, like I mentioned, when the plane pushes off the gate until they get to the arrival station, the door is always armed. And when she says she unlatched it, what she's referring to is disarming the door. Because all the doors are armed, so that if you were to open the door, the slide would automatically go in the airplane. What people may not be aware of is that that process only works if the door is open from the inside. So if the flight attendant opens the door from the inside, the slide will fill with air and it will come out. If you open the door from the outside, the slide will not deploy. Because if we have an emergency situation, the fire department wants to come and open the door, we don't want to have a face full slide. So the procedures are written for safety, because the reason that it's written this way is that there are times where the flight attendant may have been distracted. In this case here, might have been busy. And if she was to open the door, or he was open the door, the slide will deploy, and you could kill the caterer, quite frankly. So that's why when they knock on the door, thumbs up, the caterer will open the door, because even if the slide was armed, the slide will not implode, essentially. So that's why we would never expect a flight attendant to ever open up the door by herself or himself. And that's why the rules say here that no flight attendant should open the door from the inside. Now, the only time the flight attendant would have permission to open the door from the inside was if the captain gave permission to it.
And
And then it would go into the, like, you can do it, but you gotta make darn sure you disarm the slide, because we're worried about safety and someone could get killed in the slide.
is there a passenger safety component to the requirement that the door only be opened? Let me ask you this question. The caterer would not be in a position to knock on the door unless the catering platform was in place. Is that
Correct.
Is that accurate?
That's
I'm not
totally accurate.
speculating about that.
No, true.
Is there a safety component to the caterer knocking on the door vis-a-vis the passengers before the door is open?
Say that again.
Sure. Is there a reason why the caterer has to be the person to knock on the door to open before it can be opened for purposes of passenger safety?
No, it's primarily to let the flight attendant know that he's about to open the door, he or she's about to
What about secondarily?
to make sure the slide is disarmed, so it doesn't, I mean, we don't, that's the biggest concern of safety, is that the slide would inflate with somebody standing on the catering platform, for instance.
Okay.
But if you follow those
Any
procedures-
questions, Mr. Green?
If you follow those procedures, there's not gonna be a gap between the catering truck and the door. If you follow the catering procedures.
Well, yes, but however, it was mentioned earlier, what you'd normally expect for a caterer, because the weight of the galley carts, the caterer would come up to the airplane, and then they stop, put the chocks underneath the gear, or their tires, and the platform would raise up almost about 7 or 8 feet. You've probably all seen it. It moves up 7 or 8 feet, because that's the only way the caterer can knock on the door. You can't knock it, it's down there. So in this particular case, it's very unusual, because the caterer was unable to even knock on the door. So you're in a position here where the only way you could have got supplies, in this case, put a hand up, would have to flight attendant open the door.
And you said the captain would have to
Yes.
tell it, and in
Yes.
this case, the captain didn't tell her, the flight attendant.
I'm unaware of that cover, I don't know. I would have to say, based on normal thing, the flight attendants would never, ever, ever initiate opening the door without telling the captain, because the captain's gonna be in front here, and all of a sudden he gets a light that says, door open, the captain's gonna assume there's an emergency egress going on. So there's communication that's done for that reason.
Any further questions from either counsel to any witness before we move into closings?
I'd like to ask flight attendant number 2, did you have authorization from any member of the flight crew to open that door?
I did not. I did not speak with the flight crew.
All right.
That's the question I asked.
Mr. Green, closing.
Oh, I think that this is all about, this ultimately, Mr. Jones had a condition, and as I said in my opening, he dealt with his condition. He sought medical attention, he got medication, he controlled his condition with his medication. And when he got on this flight, he told flight attendant number 1 about his condition, about his need for his medication. And then when this unusual event happened, they were stuck in a tarmac for 2 hours. He again approached and asked flight attendant number 1 for help, and he told flight attendant number 1 that he needed his medication, his bag was missing, and flight attendant number 1 didn't help him, didn't look for the bag, didn't tell anyone else about his condition. Flight number 2, very nice person, but she didn't have permission to open the door the way she did.
Let's see.
left a gap. If she had followed procedures, the door would not have been open. If she had even half followed procedures, she would have had a beverage card that would have stopped Mr. Jones from falling to his demise. Mr. Jones, you have to consider in assigning his fault, like what is his responsibility? You have to consider that he could not control his anxiety, and he said it. And he said, please hurry, I can't control my anxiety. So when you're assigning fault, you have to consider that he could not control himself. When a child does something wrong, you don't blame the child. He didn't have the reasonable person's ability to control his actions. The people that had the duty, flight attendant number 1 had the duty to help him, had the duty to help him get his medication, respond to his cry for help. Flight number 2, if she had followed the procedure, the door would have been open. So I would say all the responsibilities on the airline, and this poor family that's left without a husband and without a father, you should not blame the victim.
Mr. Jones was not a child. Mr. Jones was given every opportunity to have access to the medication that he needed. He was told, keep it on your person, or put it in the seat pocket in front of you. He ignored those instructions and instead put the bag in the overhead bin. He had the opportunity to take responsibility for his own needs. He understood his own needs better than anyone. The flight attendants are not doctors. They're not treating him for his anxiety. They were told simply, I have medication that I'll need access to, and he was told, well then, hang on to it for the flight. There's been some discussion about the opening of the door. That's simply a red herring. There's no question about whether if the flight attendant pushed the door open or the caterer pulled the door open, that there would have been some different outcome here. The fact is, Mr. Jones saw daylight and ran for it, and in the process assaulted our flight attendant, pushed her to the ground, and then jumped out of the door. Whether or not there was a procedure for some different door opening mechanism, that's irrelevant to what happened here. I'm going to raise one additional issue, which goes to our pending motion for summary judgment. And that's the issue of the Airline Deregulation Act, which establishes a express preemption for actions taken by an airline with regard to their rates, their routes, or their services. And as we've heard from all of these witnesses, stowing of luggage, moving of luggage is a service that they provide in a routine basis. Providing food, beverages to their passengers is a routine, normal service that they provide for their passengers. So what happened here is simply an incident that is covered by the normal services that the airline provides, and we expect that our motion will be granted.
All right. Breaking from character for a moment. Everybody should have a number 3 on a piece of paper in front of them, and I would ask them to write down their apportionment of fault, if any, among the 2 parties. And then I will briefly give you my decision, and then we will discuss yours. And there is, as I can assure you, there is no great science to what I'm doing, and as a mediator, there's always a range, and I'm sort of basing this on a range. And I guess what I perceive to be the midpoint of the range. But in reviewing the facts before this arbitrator, I do believe this is a case in which there is an apportionment of liability to make as between the airline and Mr. Jones. I note specifically in considering Mr. Jones' potential culpability that he did receive instructions and recommendations from the airline as to how he should handle his medication at a time in which he was fully capable of appreciating them and understanding them, yet he chose not to follow them. The flight attendant's initial notification as to the baggage and movement of the baggage does not play a significant role in my decision, However, later on, they did have a heightened sense of awareness of Mr. Jones' immediate need for the medication. And although they were tasked with they were multitasking at the time during unusual circumstances, I believe that his words to the effect of urgency did give them a duty to give his medication and finding it and locating it for him a greater priority. And I believe also that duty is further compounded by the fact that it was their movement of medication that brought about the situation. With regard to the unusual procedure, I do understand, and I think it's essentially stipulated that there is no procedure for for opening the door and attending to catering while the aircraft is on the runway. However, they do have an at-gate procedure that would seem to have at least been something that would have been available to airline as a guideline, and are safety components for that gate-side procedure. Had they followed those procedures, the door would not have been opened until the platform, as I understand it, was leveled with the door, and the accident would not have happened. For these reasons, and considering all the facts and circumstances before me, I apportion fault 65% to the plaintiff and 35% to the airline. Okay. I open the floor. I would like somebody whose appraisal of the case changed significantly to be the first person to address us. Go ahead.
I went from airline exonerated as the typical defense attorney, with more listen to some key facts. You said your expertise was he could have told the passenger to keep it on you, because in case we have to evacuate, he's going to need it out in the field. That's not what he was told. It was not stressed. He was told, keep it on you or keep it in the seat back. Too nebulous. Violation number 1. You do have a catering services guideline. You follow what you do have if you don't have something else. Catering plane side, if you're waiting 3 hours, still hooked up to the jet bridge with the door open because you're stuck on the tarmac because of lightning, would have followed that procedure. Out on the ramp, would have followed that procedure. I failed to see any significant difference as the arbitrator between that and sitting on the runway. Highly unusual situation, but still, follow the procedure you know, which is proven with a safety practice. Wait until the caterer gives a thumbs up, means he's at the level, as you noted. The bars are there, the ramp is there. It's safe to open that door for both a slide practice and from a safety practice, whether you have the beverage cart or not. Doesn't really matter. Whether he knocks you down at that point, doesn't really matter. So had flight attendant 2 not opened the door until this procedure, we had no accident.
And what was the evolution of your apportionment from the first to the second to the third?
Went from 100% against, and to the second, I was splitting it, and then as I listened, I wound up, airline, you pay the freight, I'm afraid.
100, you went from 100 one way to 100 the other.
Yeah.
All right, very interesting. Some other perspectives. Anybody who's gone the other way? Anybody who thinks I really undersold the plaintiffs in this case? Let's hear it. Anybody else would like to share the evolution of their evaluation from just the video to the passenger profile to the closing?
Just have one observation. It didn't seem like the regulation with regard to blocking the passageway in the aisle with the beverage cart would have made a whole lot of difference in this case. If you have an out-of-control passenger who really can't control his faculties and is willing to knock down a flight attendant on his way to the open doorway, do we really think a beverage cart would have prevented him from doing so? If he's looking to knock down a flight attendant, I can't imagine he'd have a problem knocking down a beverage cart on the way up.
Didn't play a role in my
Beverage cart.
at least not a significant one.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Who else has had a significant change from the opening number to the closing number in terms of apportionment? As we wind down, yes.
The flight attendants boasted about their primary responsibility is the safety of the passengers. That, to me, is a medical urgency. That passenger safety needed to be addressed, and they failed to do that. So I switched to the airlines 100%.
100%. Who came down with a greater percentage to the airline by a show of hands by the time we were done? 100, more than 51% or more to the airline by a show of hands, up high. You can't not vote. Everybody votes. All right, come on. All right, now who had, all right, so that had 51% or more to the airline. But then some of those who came down on the passenger side with a higher comparative fault. Let me get some of your thinking on the comparative fault. Help us out, yes.
Well, I think having the flight attendant, having pushed aside the flight attendant really is an intervening cause that regardless of what the airline did, once you do that, once you go and push a flight attendant out of the way that's in front of the door, you've taken some serious actions to get yourself out of that plane that shouldn't be expected. Also, if you have such a medical emergency that you didn't announce it to the airline beforehand, and you're only announcing it on the airplane, I think you do have to say something more than what is that you have an urgent need. In fact, there's a federal aviation regulation that I've used before. It's 382.111 that says the flight attendant's only duty to assist passengers who have medical assistance is if they self-identify that they have this need. And I don't think he reached that level. So my question would be, it's not an ADA preemption issue. It's actually a FAA Act preemption issue. Once you set foot on that plane, those doors close, you enter a rule of federal aviation regulations, and he did not violate, the flight attendants did not violate any identifiable federal aviation regulation. Now, it may have been nice for them to look for that bag or take some of these other actions, but until they actually violate a federal aviation regulation, that becomes a standard of care. And they never violated that, so I think this is a summary judgment issue. And so I actually reduced mine from, before I found out that there was a flight attendant that got bowled over, I had the plaintiff at 30% liable, and then I reduced it to 0 for the airline.
It just goes to show how reasonable minds can differ. Well, for those of you who don't know this, the practice of arbitration by ambush is alive and well at ADCOM. And I would like to thank everybody who participated, our advocates, our witnesses. We handed all of this at the last minute. As for me, I will tell you that this is something that I really look forward to every year. I think it's a tremendous conference, and my compliments to RTI and all the people I mentioned before. And my last thing I will say is just I wanted to throw this out there during the unusual cases. I think what tops my most unusual fact patterns of cases I've handled, and this is one where I was on the coverage side, but I had to look at the underlying liability, is where a pedestrian hit by a car sued the operators of an air show because the driver was distracted by a low-flying aircraft. To me, that's a topic. Anyway, I'd like to again thank everyone, and Ted, maybe have some words to close up with, but I hope to see everybody here next year, and I hope to be invited back, of course.
Thank you, Rick. So